it's really problematic. I mean, first of all, a lot of what we've got in this industry is based upon scale. The kind of economies of scale you're just not going to see here. The second is that propulsion has moved towards more and more efficient, as I mentioned before, high bypass. Typically, at the time of Concorde, take you back, commercial baseline engines were 1-to-1 bypass, and Concorde was a little less than that. You started to see the advent of high bypass turbofans around the time Concorde entered service. Those were about 4 or 5-to-1. Today's commercial jet engines, the very best that are just coming online, are 11 or 12-to-1. That is to say, there's an awful lot of air not being burned going around. That makes them quieter, much more efficient. A supersonic engine still needs to be around 1-to-1. Now, variable cycle, that's intriguing. Could we harvest that? Yeah, the Air Force has looked at variable cycle many times over the years, kind of pulled back from that as being a bit too expensive, a bit too complex, but it might just surface again as a very promising technology. Is it available for today's use? I don't think so. What we're looking at doing today is taking an off-the-shelf engine, probably what Aerion's going to do, I'm sure what Boom is going to do, and simply refanning it to a much smaller fan so you get a much lower bypass ratio. When Boom flew their demonstrator back a couple years ago, they punted on the issue. They used a 50-year-old engine just to say they had an engine. And they're proving an airframe, which is great. But really, the key enabling technology here is the engine.
And that's true. But again, we won't see innovation in this for a while until we're able to, at least I contend, until we're able to create a market around it and start getting money infused into these things. Like the big players are all looking at supersonic flight, at least on the margins. But where we're seeing disruption, at least right now, is with these small players. And whether they are able to, pardon the pun, take off or not, it really will depend on creating standards for what can happen today. And by the concerns of yore, what sunk the Concorde over land is the idea that there are environmental concerns and noise concerns, and those go away if you actually look at the scientific research. A lot of them do.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. So I know that, with all of the action around potentially lifting the supersonic ban over land, there's been environmental groups that have been concerned about, what the effect of that on the environment would be. Can you give us a brief rundown of what their concerns are and whether they're valid?
Sure. So when it looked like we might lift up the ban over land here in the U.S., a few folks wrote a lot of op-eds in the New York Times and released a report. Carl Pope, from the executive director of the Sierra Club, was one of them, and he primarily cited that these vehicles are inefficient and they could lead to catastrophic ozone loss. And then there was another report from the ICCT, the International Council on Clean Transportation, that tried to estimate, based on one of Boom's marketing models, whether or not these things would actually be efficient or not. And so we'll take both claims first. First, the ozone loss it's been debunked. In the 70s, scientists realized that after the Soviet Union and the U.S. conducted nuclear bomb tests that basically generated enough emissions or enough of this, the same kind of chemical released by supersonic jets. Basically, I think the quote was 500 Concordes running 7 hours a day for 5 years with each of those tests. And there was no ozone loss. We also know that at least supersonic planes going create as much ozone as they rise to 55,000 feet as they offset. So they're essentially ozone neutral. So that claim is bunk. Emissions, obviously, we have to see where the technology goes. Traditionally, Concordes did run significantly inefficient. And as Richard has claimed, as cited, that it's likely that the new engines will be less efficient as related to subsonic, as related to their subsonic counterparts. Now, it is also true that totally internationally, emissions from all jets and all aviation accounts for about 2% of emissions worldwide. And these technologies are insanely hard to decarbonize because they rely on the power-dense nature of fossil fuels. So given the fact that they're only 2% of emissions worldwide, they're simply not the main contributor to climate change in the transportation sector. Look to carbon, you can look to major transport ships or cars for that if you really want to create these efficiencies. And even if all of this happens and we introduce supersonic flight and it is inefficient, there's an agreement with ICAO called CORSIA, which basically states that all international travel, after 2020, there can be no net new emissions. This applies to subsonic and supersonic planes, and it will take place long before any supersonic plane is incorporated. Now, there's some issues around whether, if we do lift the ban over land, whether this will apply in the Paris agreements, because we've obviously backed out of those, and that would apply to domestic aviation. But that's another issue entirely. Yeah.
And on the noise limit complaints, so I know that you guys have argued that they're having just like a strict ban over supersonic booms over land doesn't make sense. Is there an alternative standard you think that would make more sense, that would be sort of a better way of recognizing that we don't want, anybody to make as loud noises as they possibly want, So how do you strike the balance there?
Well, I think Eli Dorado and Sam Hammond over at the Mercatus Institute released a great report a couple years ago that looked at this, and it basically argued that you would want to create a standard that is lower than the Concorde, right? You want a less of a boom than a Concorde, but still meets the other sound from other types of noises that we're used to today, less than a jackhammer, but maybe the as loud as a motorcycle passing by, and just creating an economically reasonable standard that also is technologically feasible and makes nuisance the same as other types of sounds. That's what they argued, and I would agree.
Richard, I want to dive back into, I think, a trade-off you alluded to in your presentation. Sometimes supersonic flight can be uncomfortable. You're usually experiencing more Gs. You're in a smaller environment, and you're paying a lot more. When you could use that same money to invest in, say, better airplane Wi-Fi. I just took a flight back from San Francisco, and my Wi-Fi didn't work at all, and that was really annoying. How would you think about those trade-offs, and what do you think customers are going to be willing to tolerate?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely the heart of the issue for me, because you look at the evolution of travel for business travelers over the years, it's night and day. I mean, anyone who's ever flown on one of the better premium carriers knows business class these days is, it's no longer the Barcalounger and a shared video screen and a TV dinner. It is now a lie-flat seat in your own pod with instant Wi-Fi connections and nice people bringing you drinks at all times. It's really night and day. And oh, good, my children aren't screaming at me. I think I'll stay here. This is really nice. And the other thing is you're not cut off. You've got, where are you racing to? This isn't doing the market any favors. This technological trend towards connectivity and comfort, the two C's, if you will. And that's why the more I look at this market, the more I'm convinced it's a business jet market. Now, the other thing about business jet markets is it tends to color everything else, because business jet utilization, fitting in Alan's point, tends to be a lot less and less of an environmental concern. Typical jetliner gets operated thousands of hours per year. A business jet in this class, if it gets operated 400, 500 hours a year, that's impressive. So in other words, I tend to think it becomes less of an issue. But everything we're saying, just looking at the airline side of things, I'd just improve the quality of product. The other thing is that from your standard airline, the people up front in those lovely pods, the ones you kind of feel this, when I travel on my own nickel, I assure you I'm with the self-loading cargo in the back of the plane, and you feel this sort of Bolshevik anger. They're paying for the airline. They're paying for you. We in the back, we're a dead loss. The guys up front, the women up front, they're paying the bills. So that's why they're catering to you. That's why they're bending over backwards and giving you the latest in quilt technology and whatever else. So I'm not so sure that this paradigm breaks anytime soon.
To follow up on that point, though, in the long run, and we're talking decades out, right? Like what Richard has been alluding to, and I've been trying to say as well. In the long run, like while this technology will primarily be for very rich folks in the beginning, like I think Boom's cheapest ticket's like $4,000 or something is what they estimate. We'll see if that works. We'll see if that works. But in the long run, like what we've seen with other technologies, whether it is the iPhone or whether it is vehicles, initially rich folks are the people that buy it, and they help create a market and generate efficiencies and create a market of scale or economies of scale, and eventually other folks are able to participate. And there is radical potential for supersonic air travel that if we're able to get the creature comforts right in a while from now, like not 5 years, maybe 20, maybe 30, for this same thing to happen. We're looking at the same thing. It's always slower in transportation, right? Look at the Tesla Roadster. That was a very expensive vehicle, and now they're trying to introduce, hopefully one of these years, a more economical model for everyone else.
Yeah. Why does speed matter? Like, why does it matter that we get to a place, 2 hours faster than we otherwise would have? I know, I've seen some people argue that there's really large economic growth effects from, being able to travel to a place in a day and then come back to still be able to tuck your kids in at night. Does that make it worth it? Does that make all these other trade-offs seem maybe more plausible?
I don't know, because I mean that's it, connectivity and comfort. But you also have one of the biggest trade-offs is range. So I think it's unrealistic to expect better than transatlantic. Trans-Pacific, that's going to be a very long time coming. The other day, free advertisement, they did not pay me for this, but Cathay Pacific just started Washington's first nonstop to Hong Kong. I mean, this is all new. This is all very new. I'm very happy to be able to do this. You know what? It's not the worst thing in the world to have to stop and refuel in Hawaii, but you have to. And with supersonics, and that kind of cuts back on the speed thing. You have to decelerate, take off, climb, whatever else, fuel. So we're really talking about a transatlantic market here. Even when we get to cross land, which, you're right, technologically, there's no reason it can't happen. No reason it can't happen. What's that market? That's kind of a Southwest market. I mean,
DC to LA in 2 hours?
DC to LA in 2 hours. You know what? You go to the front of these jets and you talk to the people there. How many are in first class on an upgrade? Guilty as charged. Very few people actually pay that kind of cash. There are bankers, we all remember the classic late 90s nerd bird that flew between Dulles and Sunnyvale, tech corridor to tech corridor. Even that never had the kind of yields you need to get to supersonic. So I like the idea, but you're still talking about a tiny minority of travel.
Perhaps. Again, we have to help create that market and see if it works. So we're a ways off from that. I would also add, there's a lot of research that looks at how improving the efficiencies of travel also boosts trade, for example. Like after World War II, when we moved to jet propulsion from propellers, we saw a 700% increase in US travel abroad. There's other research that shows that when you increase, I think it's from Jennifer Poole over at American, actually. When you increase the amount of folks coming here by